Welcome back to our Unity Roguelite tutorial series. Last time we implemented our level traversal mechanics and created a system in which we can explore the dungeon infinitely. So in this video, we're going to be working on our character sprite and implementing our movement animations. This video is going to be much lighter than the last two, so it's going to give us a much needed break, but still making some forward progress and adding some polish to our project. So let's jump right into it. First, we'll import our sprites into the project. Let's add them into our sprites folder. So I'm going to go out to my assets, go to my sprites folder, and then I'm going to click import new asset. And then we're just going to go to wherever our sprites are. So for you, this will likely be different than mine, but I've got some assets here. We've got our characters. I'm going to use my main character here, which is this elf PNG. Okay, so let's go ahead and import those. Then we'll need to go ahead and set up our sprites. So for mine, it's a sprite sheet. So we're going to set my sprite mode to multiple. My pixels per unit is going to be 16 because each of these by themselves are going to be 16 by 16. Then we'll change our filter mode to point and our compression node to none. And that's going to make sure our sprites show up really cleanly in our scene. Okay, so let's go ahead and slice our sprites. So it used automatic slicing, which isn't correct. So you do grid by cell size, and then we're going to set our X to 16 and our Y to 16. And again, that's just because I'm using 16 by 16 sprites. So if you have different size sprites, you'll use whatever size your sprites are. So if they're like 32 by 32, you'll use 32 by 32. Okay, so we'll slice that. And then we'll go ahead and apply the slicing. And then we can close our sprite editor. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our player sprite. So we'll click on our player, go to 0, 0. So here is our current player sprite. We're just using a capsule as a placeholder. And we have our sprite renderer on our player. So let's go ahead and change our sprite renderer from capsule to our first player here. So let's go ahead and drag and drop that in there. And that's going to change to our sprite. And then this is actually quite small, I think, now for our current sprite. So let's change the scale from 0.4 to maybe to 0.8. I think that that's going to feel better for our sprite, but we can always change it later. So we'll give that a go. And then we'll need to fix our capital collider because it's really big. So we'll go ahead and click the Edit Sprite button, which is going to be right here. Edit Collider button. Here we go. And then you'll find that we get these like little handles on our collider. So we'll go ahead and we'll drag those into the size of our sprite. And then we'll get this to like close to where the bottom of our sprite is. I'd say about there. And then this one will be in line with our top, which is about there. Okay, and it doesn't need to be perfect. It's fine if part of our sprite's sticking out of our collider. We just need something that's pretty close. And I'd prefer to use the capsule because it will be a little bit more forgiving than just using a square. So like if the player gets hit here, we won't die. And when we're walking around corners, if we kind of clip it, it will just kind of keep going instead of like stopping our movement altogether. So, all right, let's go ahead and save that. And then we're going to update our movement script to allow us to set up our walking animations and everything like that. So first we're going to start off really easy and simple. And we're going to just flip our sprite back and forth depending on which direction we're facing. So let's go ahead and open up our player movement script. And then in our script, we're going to need to add a couple of variables here. So first, we're going to need to keep track of which direction we're facing so we can know which direction to flip our sprite. So let's go ahead and create a private vector2, and we'll call this last move direction. I'm going to set this up to a vector2.right by default, since that's the direction our sprite's facing by default is right. Okay, so if we look, so they're facing right, so that will be our default. Okay, and then we're going to need a reference to our sprite renderer, so that way we can say to flip which direction our sprite's facing. So we'll say private sprite renderer, I'm just going to call it sprite renderer. And then in our wake function, we're going to need to grab our sprite renderer off of our game object. So we'll say sprite renderer equals get component and then sprite renderer. Okay. And now what we can do is in our fixed update, after we move, we'll go ahead and check which direction we should be facing. So we only want to do that if we're moving. And if we take a look at our sprites folder, we can see that we actually only have, here, let me actually just open it in my sprite editor so you can see it better. So we don't have 4 directions, we only have 2 directions, and that's left and right. So this one is meant to feel like a Game Boy game, and in that time period we didn't always have 4 directional. So when we moved up, we just kept running in the direction we were facing, but then we went up or down on the screen. So that's what this one is. So we only have left and right, so those are the only ones we're going to really care about when we're checking our facing direction. And because of that, we only need to check if our movement input.x is greater than 0 or less than 0. So as long as it's not 0, so we'll check that. So we'll say movement input.x does not equal, and then we can just say 0. Okay, so if our movement.x is not 0, it means we're moving. So we will change our last movement direction to whatever direction we're currently moving. So we'll say last move direction dot x equals our movement input dot x. Okay, and then what we'll want to do is we'll want to set our sprite renderer's flip x boolean. So sprite renderer, so we see we have a flip x boolean here, and that means it's going to flip the direction of our sprite on the x axis. So it'll change from left to right. Anyway, we're going to set this using our using some logic. So if our move direction.x is smaller than 0, it means that we're moving left because it'll be a negative number. So we can use that as a way to check that we need to flip our character. So we can say movement input.x is less than 0f. And then we'll use our semicolon. Okay, so now if we save and then we go back to Unity, we shouldn't need to set anything up because everything is being set up privately on our player. We'll click play, and when we move to the left, our sprite will face the left direction. When we move back to the right, it'll face our right direction. And when we stop moving, it's going to continue to face the direction that we were last facing. All right, so now we're ready to set up our animations and get our animations playing over top of this as well. So in our sprites folder, we've got our character. So this first 3 frames is the idle animation, and this is our idle animation for facing right. There's also an idle animation for facing left, so that's these 3. But because we're using the flip X, we actually won't need this. Our right-facing idle animation will work just fine for both directions. And then we have our next 4 frames after that are our running animation. So these are the animations that we care about, okay? So what we're going to do is, in order to create our animations, we will click on the first 3 frames, and we're going to hold down Shift to make sure we select all 3 of them. And we'll drag them onto our player game object. And what that's going to do is it's going to create an animation for us. So in our assets folder, let's create a new animations folder to save our animation in. And then I'm just going to call this one idle animation. And we're going to save it in there. Okay, and what that did for us is it added an animator to our player, and it created a controller, animation controller for our player. And this is going to allow us to play our animations. So if we go ahead and open up our animation controller, we can see that our idle animation was added to it as the default state. So if we press play, whenever we see our player, they'll be idling. And for right now, it's the only animation we have, so they're just going to be idling all the time. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop playing, and then let's go ahead and set up our running animation as well. And we're going to do this the same way. So we'll open our sprites folder. So we'll go from, so our first three were our idle right, our second three are idle left. So here's the start of my running animation, and our running animation is 4 frames. So I'm going to click all of those, select them, and then drag them also onto my player. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, take 2. All right, there we go. So now we'll go ahead and select our animations folder to save them in. And then we're going to call this running and then underscore animation. And that's going to add our running animation to our player controller for animations. Okay, so now that we have those set up, we'll need to make sure that we can transition from our idle animation to our running animation once we start moving. So to make a transition, we're going to go ahead and right click on our idle transition, and we'll write make transition. And that's going to give us this little line off of our idle. And then we're going to click on our running animation. And that's going to set our transition. And then we're also going to transition from our running back to our idle. So when we stop moving, we can make sure that we're idling again. So let's go ahead and right click, create make transition, and then click on our idle animation. All right, so now that we've got that, we're going to need to set up some conditions for us to be able to start running and stop running. So in order to start running from our idle, we're going to go ahead and click on the transition between them. And you'll see that we've got some options here. We have a conditions list. And so this is where we're going to set up how do we get from our idle to our running. So what's going to cause that transition? And so what's going to cause that transition for us is that we're going to start moving. And then when we're running, how we stop running and get back to idle, so we'll click on that transition, is that we'll add a condition to our conditions list that says we're no longer moving. Okay, so in order to get that started, we'll need to go to our parameters tab in our animator, just up here at the top. And this should contain an empty list. And what we'll do is we'll click this plus sign and we'll create a Boolean, which means it'll be a true false value. So moving and is not moving. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click that to add the parameter. And then I'm going to name mine is moving with a lowercase I at the beginning. And now we can use this parameter to set up our transition. So first from idle to running, we'll click on that transition and we'll set up a condition, is moving is true. And if that's true, then we'll start moving. We're also going to uncheck has exit time. So that way, as soon as this is true, we'll just automatically stop running or stop idling and then go straight into running. So we'll uncheck that. And then for our transition from running back to idle, we'll set our conditions list to have is moving is false. And again, we're going to uncheck our has exit time, and then we can go ahead and save everything. All right, so now that we have our animator set up, we can go ahead and close our animator window. So if you right click on this animator tab, you can say close tab. And then what we'll do is we'll go to our player movement script, and we will get access to our animator. So let's go ahead and create a private variable for that. This is animator, and I'm just going to call mine animator. And then we're going to set up our animator in our wake function. So animator equals get component animator, which is right here. And then once we have our animator, after we check which direction we should face, we will tell our animator whether or not we're moving. So we'll say animator.setBool. And we're using setBool because our parameter that we created is a Boolean. And then the next thing we'll add is the name of our parameter, which is moving, with the lowercase I at the beginning. And then after our name, we can pass in the value we want to set it. So if we're moving, that means our movement input .x or our movement input .y is going to be either less than 0 or greater than 0. So basically just not 0. So we can compare our movement input to vector 2.0. And if it's not that, then it means that we're moving. And if it is that, then it means that we're not moving. So what we can do is we'll say movement input does not equal, and then we'll say vector 2.0. Oops. Vector 2.0. and then a semicolon. So every frame is going to tell the animator whether or not we're moving by checking our movement input. And if both our X and our Y are greater than 0 or 1 or the other, as long as both of them are not 0, this will return true. And if none of them are 0 or 1 is and the other's not, then we'll go ahead and we'll say that we're moving. Okay, so we'll save that. So now that we're back in Unity, we can go ahead and hit play to test it out. We don't need to update anything because everything is private and it's getting set in our awake function. Okay, so now that we're in our scene, we should be able to see that we have our running animation when we move at all. So if we move left and right, we'll have our running animation for our left and right directions. If I move up, we'll see that we keep our direction that we're facing, but we still have our running animation for our player. So it still looks like we're running when we're moving those directions. And then we still have our flips. Okay, so that wraps up this video for our Unity Roguelite tutorial series. We've made great progress by adding our character sprite and implementing our directional movement, ensuring that our sprite flips correctly when moving left or right. We also built our animation system, giving our character life with smooth transitions between idle and running states. In the next video, we'll continue enhancing our player mechanics by diving into our health system. We'll be layering even more complexity and polish into our game. If you found this tutorial helpful, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more Unity tutorials, and leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. I'd love to hear how your project is coming along. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep creating, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next video.